Hello everyone, welcome to our session here, 3 hidden reasons why your system may be slow. I'm joined today by Tim Andaya, Senior Technical Consultant for Strategic Systems Group. Tim, let's go ahead and dive in with the first of those 3 hidden reasons. Let's talk a little bit about hardware and infrastructure.
Sure. A lot of times businesses will purchase hardware with a certain task in mind, and then it of course ends up doing more than it originally had planned. And so hardware tends to get pushed a little further along than it should as far as time is concerned. Average lifespan expected for computer hardware is 3 to 5 years. In the field, I encounter systems that have been going on 10 years. That can slow all of your processes down, and rebuilding them or reorganizing them can become difficult or in certain instances economically unfeasible at the time. As technology progresses, we're finding more and more that you get an overutilization or an overloaded network infrastructure. Networks were designed originally or primarily for data, and now we are using them as multimedia transport mechanisms. So essentially you've got your TV running across your network, your voice over IP running across your network. This can lead to overloaded infrastructure, which can slow you down. We also have everyone wants to stretch that budget dollar, so you have older workstations. Oftentimes they're not always patched very well, that people just keep limping along on and are not often budgeting properly to replace and sunset them and pull them out of the production environment. Another thing you find, which really isn't so much a hardware item in this instance, but people are starting to use terminal servers for their application sessions so that they only have to install applications in one place and then maintain it at that single place, where they'll leave a shortcut on the client workstation to activate the application that runs through a terminal server. Most users are used to just hitting the X button to exit an application, but you need to be retrained for things like this with terminal server, where closing that will close the terminal server session on the desktop but leave the terminal server session running on the terminal server. So you end up with an application that's open, and this can cause problems for backups, for instance, or you got too many users logged in, even though only 3 people are running the application. You have a license for 5, and it says, hey, there's 6 people running this. Nobody else can log in.
That's some great information. Thanks, Tim. So let's dive into kind of the next section here, the ERP or business applications themselves. What are some of the challenges that might slow down the performance from there?
What I encounter most clients where I come in to take a look at how their systems are running is inconsistent or non-existent business application maintenance. Almost all larger enterprise resource planning applications and accounting systems require a certain amount of maintenance, either weekly or monthly, some kind of regular schedule in order to function correctly. And oftentimes these are things that are not done consistently in the businesses, and it's something that we are often helping our customers automate so that they can take care of this or have this taken care of, so that they have a minimum of problems related to standard maintenance. Another issue is often you might have an antiquated or an unpatched version of your business application, and it's starting to show that it is older, going again back to inconsistent and non-existent business application maintenance. You start to see performance hits, lookups take longer, manual entry, someone does a repetitive entry, they hit tab or enter into the next screen, and the system thinks about it because it's got to go through the parts or it's got to go through the services, look up to figure things out. And because, again, of inconsistent maintenance, things start to slow down. Almost every modern business application runs on some form of database, and the databases also require maintenance and care and feeding. It's something that is often inconsistent in smaller businesses. With larger businesses where they have a budget for IT, generally this is less the reality, but it still does happen where you just don't have time or inclination to do that maintenance because it doesn't generate revenue. And standard database maintenance, like making sure that the transaction logs are not too large and everything's being cleaned up, periodically rebooting a database server, not every week, but maybe once a month, just to cut down on memory consumption, and monitoring things these things is not something that smaller businesses are equipped or even trained to do properly.
Tim, you touched on something that was interesting there, and I wanted to kind of go back to that. But even in the scenario where you've got an internal IT staff or maybe a managed IT provider, is it a scenario where they just don't know, those folks who are doing it just don't necessarily have the expertise in how to maintain the business applications, the ERP solutions, and so that's why maybe some of this isn't being done?
A little bit of both. I came to consulting from the user standpoint. I originally managed a company and handled all of their data, and so I understood the business and I learned the hardware and the software. And in smaller businesses, that's often the case where you have an inexperienced person maintaining things, doing the best that they can. And then as you move up into larger businesses, their in-house staff, generally they pick what they can afford, and they'll get a hardware person who, again, becomes that sort of quasi-trained database administrator. And they do the best that they can with the help from dummies guides. A dedicated DBA is kind of an expensive person to have around unless you need that kind of expertise in-house at all times. And so again, this is a place where database maintenance tends not to happen all that consistently. In larger organizations where they have the resources, it's less of a problem. But again, oftentimes you don't really have DBAs there, a DBA being a database administrator, someone who's trained for that. You have somebody who, they're tech savvy, they know to do a few things, they know how to back up a database, but they don't necessarily know how to make sure that the indexes are running or run a trace on the database to see if there's some place where they might need to add an index that the original application provider didn't think was necessary. Things like that are often pretty common.
You mentioned a couple of times that element of maintenance, and I'm often brought back to thinking about it in terms of the kinds of things that we think about for our cars. We're coming up on the winter season, so you want to check your tires, you want to make sure that they're properly maintained, you want to make sure you've got good windshield wipers on there. If you're in a snowy climate, maybe you're actually going to the point of putting on snow tires. there seems like there's an element here that a lot of organizations maybe don't realize, that running those ERP solutions and related applications that surround your ERP solutions, that they require some element of regular ongoing maintenance as well. Can you talk maybe just a little bit around that, and what maybe are there some guidelines that people should be thinking about?
You mean something other than I put gas in it, I push the gas pedal down, and the car goes?
Yeah, exactly. That's, I think that's the perspective that maybe a lot of people have, and maybe that's what we're trying to educate them around, is the fact that there is some element of that maintenance that still needs to be done here.
Well, yeah, it is something that needs to be done, and it's also one of the things that we come in, and that's one of the first things that we do. We recommend, as part of, like a car, you come in for every X thousand miles. With databases or modern databases, it's a lot easier to automate these things and have the database get checked periodically, whether it's once a week or once a month, and have the database backed up. And oftentimes people are worried about how much space do I need for my backups, and that really goes to your, what's your reportability requirement, and what would happen if the database went away tomorrow? How do I put this without being too technical? There are utilities that the database has built in that you can run against the databases themselves to keep them in good running shape. And automating that is reasonably simple if you know what you're doing. And once it's automated, on top of that, you kind of have to have somebody get a notice if something is wrong, or get a notice whether it runs or not. And it's really hard for a lot of companies to be willing to look at that as something that they need to do. It's either they think it's going to cost them too much, or they think, well, it's, I bought it, it was expensive, it should work. And for the price of some software, you could buy, or at least you could buy part of a limousine. And people often expect these things to run without much care and feeding, and it's just not true. You can't do that. Power outages can cause data damage, and if you have a power outage, you should stop and take a look at the consistency of your data. I know that a lot of companies don't really look at it that way. They say, oh, the power was out, we turned everything back on, and everything came back up. That will hobble, that can hobble your system pretty quickly. And just like sports injuries that are ignored, over time you start limping, and performance expectations should be lowered if you're not going to pay attention to the care and feeding of your application's infrastructure. I don't have any nicer way to put it.
So it sounds like there's an element here of kind of to continue the analogy we used earlier, a low oil light and maybe a check engine light, and if you're not paying attention to those things, then bad things can happen.
Well, it's a little bit worse than that, because at least with cars we have dummy lights. Most service level software, like databases, they don't really have dummy lights. They do have a place where they write events that occur that are either catastrophic or informational, but the average small business does not have time every day to go through the error logs and the event logs. Microsoft SQL Server not only writes to the application log that for the Windows events logs, but it also has its own error logs, which are a little bit more technical in their and terse in the information they provide, which makes them even harder to read, even for technical people. So, yes, there are no dummy lights with applications, and so you actually have to take the time to set up those warnings and alerts, and a mechanism to get those warnings and alerts when they occur, so that you can address them ahead of time rather than recovering from them afterwards.
Fantastic. Well, let's move on to our third category here. What are some other possibilities that maybe we haven't covered?
Well, I did cover unmonitored failures. So user literacy with respect to phishing and virus attacks, which are becoming more prevalent in email and on web pages. There are new trends with targeted, concerted phishing attacks to lure you out to websites that are malicious. System compromises from, again, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, a location that, even though you thought you were going to a website of a well-known business partner, or some legitimate reason, you clicked on a banner ad thinking everything would be fine and ended up getting taken to the wrong place, and something was deposited onto your computer that could be monitoring it, or could have turned part of your system resources into a zombie that's now trying to find its way out of the network, or figure out more about what's going on your network. All of these things can do that.
All right. I guess we'll open it up to any final questions.
I actually have one more thing I might mention, but this is outside of kind of the scope of what could make your application go slow. But a lot of companies aren't also tracking what's going out the door in their businesses, and it is something that they might want to consider evaluating. And when I say what's going out the door, I mean what kind of services or information is leaving the premises. It's very difficult nowadays because almost everything uses HTTP and SSL for getting in and out of the business, but there are other types of services or communication stream that use other ports, and businesses generally don't block those when they probably should be, just to protect themselves from themselves.
So you're talking about more of a data leakage there?
I'm just talking about unrestricted outbound traffic of any type, other than those that we're kind of stuck with, which is basically web streaming. You could be draconian and only allow just web and SSL out the door, which tends to be a little bit too harsh. But it's probably a good idea to evaluate what services you do want to go out the door and limit your users to just that. And then if something new comes up and a new Teams communication requirement, then if company evaluates whether that's necessary for the company, and then if so, open those ports up. But I feel it's better to basically have less ways out, just like we have fewer ways in. So I just believe that being responsible for your network means being responsible for what's leaving your network as well as what's coming in.
So Tim, we've been talking about hidden reasons why your system may be running slow. Do you have a customer story? Maybe not necessarily name names, but something you've experienced, something you've seen from a real world standpoint that was an example of a system performance issue represented by, the system was running slow, but what was really going on behind the scenes?
Yes, I do. This is several years ago now, but one of our customers was experiencing. They had a problem with it. They were running out of storage, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And they had asked us to look at it. And it turned out what I found was that there were multiple intrusions into their primary file server, and the system had been subjugated by not one but 3 different Juarez server type hackers, and they were hosting and pushing and pulling files through that file server. And I had to clean out those applications that were running basically the FTP file transferring and file sharing systems, clean out those files, and then also I helped them with their firewall system. We had to actually shut down outbound traffic for several systems so that I could eradicate the intrusion software, which was also trying to find its way out and complain when I started to kill processes. The server started to get very active as far as traffic out the door. There were actually software monitoring whether the file transfer and file sharing services were running, and clearly when they stopped there was something wrong, and so they were trying to phone home and let the thieves, we'll call them that, know that there was something wrong with their cache of ill-gotten goods. And that is not all that uncommon, something that could happen, especially if you're not aware that you need to be monitoring traffic inbound and outbound on your network. And in this instance, the customer, literally, they were doing things like they were copying their older files off to archive and then deleting their files, essentially to make more room for the hackers who had subjugated their system. It was very costly for them to have me fix that, and they were grateful when it was through, but it was pretty costly. It took me a couple of days to stop all of the software that was running. When you looked for it, as far as what applications were running with Task Manager, etc., I had to break out some other utilities in order to find the applications.
Wow, well, this has been fantastic, Tim. Really, really appreciate it. These have been some great tips on hidden reasons why your ERP solution may be slow. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, and look forward to another discussion in the future.